His head was cut off on a beach outside Constantinople. It was November 4th, 711. Justinian II, former emperor of the Byzantine Empire, had been captured after a second coup. He was trying to flee, possibly seeking help from allies, when he was overtaken. Soldiers loyal to Philippicus Bardanes executed him without ceremony. His severed head was later sent to Philippicus, who had seized the capital days earlier. Justinian was around 42 years old. His final moments were not dignified. No courtroom, no trial, no final statement. Just the end of a man who had ruled the empire twice, mutilated once, and returned to power only to collapse again in violence and betrayal. His young son Tiberius, no more than 6 years old, was executed shortly after. With their deaths, Justinian's line was extinguished. He had once been the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman world. By the end, he was a fugitive with no allies left. Rumors had followed him for years, including grotesque accusations of madness, cruelty, and even unnatural relations with animals. The latter accusation, made in later retellings, likely served as slander to destroy what was left of his reputation. Justinian II had once restored his throne through sheer will and violence, but in the end, even that could not save him. He didn't begin as a tyrant, just a boy with a crown and a court that expected greatness. Justinian II was born around 668 or 669 in Constantinople, during a time of external threats and internal factionalism in the Byzantine Empire. He was the only known son of Emperor Constantine IV and Empress Anastasia. From birth, he was marked as the heir to the Eastern Roman Thronia, rare clarity in a dynasty often plagued by uncertainty and usurpation. His father was a capable but hard-pressed ruler who had just repelled Arab forces in the First Arab Siege of Constantinople. In 681, at the age of 12 or 13, Justinian was formally crowned as co-emperor, a practice meant to ensure smooth succession. This early elevation was strategic. It secured dynastic continuity and demonstrated the emperor's trust in his son. It also placed immense expectations on a child who had not yet reached maturity. When Constantine IV died in 685, Justinian II became sole ruler at approximately 16 years old. Young, energetic, and surrounded by experienced advisors, his early reign began with signs of promise. He negotiated a favorable treaty with the Umayyad Caliphate, temporarily stabilizing the empire's eastern frontier. He also took a personal interest in administration, taxation, and military affairs, suggesting a ruler who intended to be active, even reform-minded. Contemporaries noted his intelligence and strong will. He invested in church building and attempted land reforms that aimed to strengthen the state's tax base. He also inherited a court where imperial power had grown increasingly absolute, and the expectation of obedience both from the aristocracy and church was deeply embedded in the imperial structure. His name, Justinian, was no accident. It echoed the famed Justinian I, the emperor who had codified Roman law and dreamed of restoring the old empire. The young ruler carried this legacy forward, whether by duty, ambition, or image. His birth into power gave him legitimacy. His early actions hinted at potential, but beneath that surface, cracks had already begun to form between ruler and ruled, between ambition and fear. But this early promise would later give way to violence and control. Justinian II was raised in the heart of imperial power. The great palace of Constantinople served as both home and training ground. As the heir to the throne, his education was elite and focused on three pillars: theology, Roman law, and imperial governance. From a young age, he was surrounded by clerics, court officials, and military commanders who all reinforced the sanctity and supremacy of imperial authority. Byzantine emperors were considered God's representatives on earth, and Justinian would have absorbed this doctrine early. The fusion of religion and rule wasn't abstract. It was daily ritual. He would have witnessed the emperor's divine role in processions, coronations, and diplomacy. This worldview was not questioned, it was instilled. His father, Constantine IV, had resisted religious divisions during his reign and had convened the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680 to settle the Monothelite controversy. The outcome, which declared that Christ had two wills, divine and human, was deeply theological but also deeply political. For Justinian, this taught a central lesson. Religious unity was a tool of state power. Disagreement was not just heresy, it was rebellion. After his father's death, Justinian took power at 16 and immediately leaned on strong advisors. Among them were bureaucrats and generals who had grown up during previous reigns of instability. From them, he inherited not only administrative models, but a deep suspicion of the aristocracy and urban elite groups that had repeatedly proven disloyal in past successions. Over time, that suspicion would harden into paranoia. One clear influence on Justinian's thinking was the precedent of earlier autocrats, particularly his namesake, Justinian I. The first Justinian had ruled with strict discipline, rebuilt Constantinople after riots, and enforced orthodoxy across the empire. Justinian II was reportedly obsessed with legacy and control, often invoking the past as justification for his harsh policies. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that he was restoring imperial greatness, but he lacked the temperament to balance power with diplomacy. As he matured, his governance grew harsher. He began to see opposition as betrayal, not debate. His methods: repression, forced population transfers, mass executions suggest that his idea of statecraft was shaped more by domination than persuasion. Even rumors that would later surface as the claim that he behaved erratically or indulged in bizarre acts are rooted in this period. Enemies described him as volatile, even deranged. Whether those rumors were exaggeration or propaganda, they reflect how early indoctrination in imperial absolutism created a ruler who saw fear as a tool. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test not in theory, but in power. In 685, at just 16 years old, Justinian II became sole emperor of the Byzantine Empire. His first reign began with energy and ambition. Determined to prove his authority, he took direct control over state affairs. Within the first year, he personally led military campaigns against the Arabs, regaining territory in Armenia and forcing the Umayyad Caliphate into a treaty that secured annual tribute payments to Byzantium. This was seen as a rare diplomatic victory. He also began relocating populations to stabilize border regions and strengthen tax collection. In particular, he moved large groups of Slavs into Asia Minor to serve as both settlers and soldiers. The goal was to reinforce imperial control in areas long threatened by raids. These forced migrations, however, bred resentment. Religiously, Justinian strengthened the authority of the Orthodox Church and closely aligned it with imperial policy. He attempted to extend Byzantine influence over the Church in Rome and increased surveillance over bishops and monastic communities within the empire. While publicly justified as defense of orthodoxy, these moves signaled a growing intolerance for dissent. Internally, Justinian's rule quickly turned severe. He cracked down on aristocratic families, purged court officials suspected of disloyalty, and raised taxes sharply, especially on the landowning class and urban merchants. The Senate, once a powerful advisory body, was increasingly sidelined. His enemies began to fear not just marginalization, but death. In 692, he convened the so-called Quinisext Council, also known as the Council in Trullo, to define moral and clerical rules. Many of its canons targeted Roman Church practices, deepening the rift between Constantinople and Rome. Justinian's insistence on enforcement showed his growing appetite for control over religious as well as civil life. He also ordered lavish building projects and celebrated military victories with elaborate triumphs. His public image was increasingly imperial, even divine. But beneath the surface, discontent grew. His tax policies alienated the provinces. His brutality unnerved the elite. His religious orthodoxy brought tensions with Rome, and his administrative micromanagement left little room for diplomacy or compromise. By 695, just 10 years into his reign, conspirators inside the capital were already moving. His early promise had turned to fear. The throne was no longer secure. Now in power, Justinian began turning belief into law and law into control. By 695, Justinian II had alienated nearly every powerful group in his empire. His heavy taxation angered landowners and city dwellers. His purges terrified the aristocracy. His centralization of church power provoked clerics. Even the military, once loyal, began to waver. In that year, a revolt began in the capital. The instigators were soldiers and officials from the Opsikion-Themion elite military district near Constantinople. Their discontent was not sudden. Justinian had punished entire units for failure, redistributed land to new settlers, and ruled with such intensity that fear replaced loyalty. The army declared a general named Leontios as emperor. He had previously served under Justinian but had been imprisoned. Now released, he became the figurehead of rebellion. The capital fell quickly. The emperor was seized and publicly mutilated, his nose cut off. In Byzantine political culture, physical disfigurement disqualified a person from ruling. It was both symbolic and practical. Justinian was no longer fit to be emperor. He was exiled to Cherson in the Crimean Peninsula. Many assumed his reign was over. Leontios took power, claiming legitimacy as a restorer of order, but he would not hold it for long. In exile, Justinian began plotting. He cultivated allies among local elites and maintained communication with his remaining supporters inside the empire. Around 702, Leontios himself was overthrown by Tiberius III, another military officer. The throne was now a revolving door. Meanwhile, Justinian escaped Cherson and took refuge with the Khazars, a powerful steppe empire. He married the Khazar Khan's sister, Theodora, and gained temporary protection. Soon, however, word reached Constantinople. Tiberius III attempted to bribe the Khazars to kill the exiled emperor. The Khan warned Justinian in time, and he fled once again, this time across the Black Sea. In 705, he reached the court of Khan Tervel of Bulgaria. There, Justinian made a deal. With Tervel's help, he would take back the Byzantine throne. Together, they marched on Constantinople. Denied entry at the gates, Justinian found a secret way in, reportedly through the old Roman aqueduct system. Once inside, his forces opened the gates. Tiberius fled, but was captured. Justinian II was emperor once again. He had returned from exile, mutilated and betrayed but not broken. This was the first known case of a Byzantine emperor reclaiming power after being deposed and disfigured. But what followed was not forgiveness, it was vengeance. Justinian was no longer just enforcing ideas now. Those ideas were becoming systems of control. Justinian II returned to power in 705, not as a reformer, but as a ruler determined to punish. His reinstallation marked a clear transition in tone. The policies of his second reign were built around retribution, suppression, and fear. The first acts were executions. Tiberius III, the man who had ruled in Justinian's absence, was publicly executed. Leontios, who had mutilated Justinian a decade earlier, was dragged from prison, humiliated in the hippodrome, and then beheaded. The former patriarch, Kallinikos I, who had endorsed Justinian's deposition, was blinded and exiled. These were not isolated punishments. They were signals. Justinian intended to eliminate every threat, every rival, and every symbol of his previous downfall. Executions, imprisonments, and mutilations became standard. Dozens of high-ranking officials, aristocrats, and suspected traitors were either purged or forced into exile. To sustain control, Justinian relied on a tightly centralized network of officials loyal only to him. He disbanded military units associated with past rebellions and replaced commanders across multiple themes with new appointees. Trust was given only to those with no prior connections to the court factions that had betrayed him. One of his most controversial campaigns involved the region of Cherson, where he had once been exiled. In 708, after a brief diplomatic breakdown, he sent military forces to attack and punish the city. It was a symbolic act, not just retribution against former captors, but a demonstration of imperial reach. However, the campaign failed. Troops mutinied, morale collapsed, and the entire operation backfired, weakening Justinian's credibility abroad and further isolating him domestically. Inside the capital, Justinian's rule became more erratic. He intensified surveillance of political enemies and expanded the use of secret informants. Arrests occurred without trial. Suspected conspirators were often executed immediately or subjected to public humiliation. Imperial orders were absolute. Questioning them was treason. Rumors circulated of his violent outbursts and unstable behavior. While some may have been exaggerated, they reflected a ruler now feared more than respected. His enemies, real and imagined, became targets. Dissent was conflated with treachery. Even minor complaints could lead to arrest. The structure of power shifted. Institutions were no longer tools of governance. They were instruments of vengeance. The Senate had no voice. The church was submissive. The army obeyed, but without loyalty. Justinian's authority was absolute, but it stood on fear, not legitimacy. Culturally, the city grew tense. Citizens avoided discussing politics. Executions in public spaces became spectacles. Children of accused traitors were banished or killed. No one was safe, not even those once close to him. His cruelty, once targeted, now expanded. A society that had once endured his ambition now suffered under his repression. Even individuals close to Justinian were targeted by these systems. By the second half of his second reign, Justinian II no longer trusted anyone and advisors, not allies, not even members of his family. The empire had become a mirror of his paranoia, silent, watchful, and brutal. One of the earliest signs was the removal of key officials who had helped restore him to power. The generals who had supported his return were dismissed or quietly executed. Some were accused of plotting without evidence. Others simply disappeared from court records. Loyalty had an expiration date. The imperial court, once a hub of ritual and diplomacy, turned cold and transactional. Conversations were guarded. Reports were filtered through layers of surveillance. Even the imperial council functioned as a rubber stamp. Justinian's decrees were no longer questioned, not because they were wise, but because dissent had become deadly. Tensions extended to his marriage. His wife, Theodora, sister of the Khazar Khan, had once been his lifeline in exile, but after his return, her influence vanished. She is rarely mentioned in records after his restoration. Whether by choice or force, she was pushed into silence. Her presence at court diminished. Her fate remains uncertain. There were also signs of detachment from his son, Tiberius. Born sometime after Justinian's return to power, the boy was named Caesar, the designated heir, but there is no record of mentorship or public grooming. Instead, the child appears in official records only as a symbol of dynastic continuity, not as a person being prepared to rule. It's possible that Justinian saw even his own son as a future threat. Informers and secret trials became common. Accusations were often anonymous, punishments immediate. No appeal was possible. Entire families were punished for the suspicion of one member. Some advisors reportedly avoided speaking directly to the emperor, fearing misinterpretation. A wrong word could cost a life. This tightening grip bred isolation. Justinian's court no longer functioned as a center of governance. It was a fortress. Power, once shared through patronage and counsel, now sat in the hands of one man whose fear outpaced his reason. The man who had clawed his way back to the throne through cunning and force now ruled alone, and the silence around him grew louder. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. By the final years of his life, Justinian II was visibly deteriorating, physically marked, increasingly isolated, and mentally unstable by most contemporary accounts. His mutilation, performed in 695, had never healed cleanly. The nose that had been cut off was reportedly replaced with a gold prosthesis, earning him the nickname Rhinomeros, the slit-nosed. It was a daily reminder of past humiliation and may have deepened his obsession with revenge and control. There are no surviving medical records, but chroniclers describe episodes that suggest paranoia, impulsivity, and emotional volatility. Some accounts note extreme mood swings, violent decrees issued without deliberation, and outbursts during public appearances. His commands became erratic, governors were dismissed without cause, and some provinces received conflicting orders. Diplomatically, he burned bridges. Relations with the papacy continued to sour, especially after the Quinisext Council. His military decisions became reactive and short-sighted. In 709, he launched a brutal campaign against Ravenna, an important Byzantine outpost in Italy. The exarch and local clergy were summoned to Constantinople under false pretenses, arrested, and in some cases executed. This campaign further alienated the western provinces and aggravated tensions with Rome. In the provinces, news of rebellion was rising. In 710, Cherson revolted again. This time, the cause was clearer: imperial oppression and forced political purges. Justinian responded with another attempt at repression, but his forces failed to contain the unrest. Meanwhile, whispers of madness circulated. Some later sources mention hallucinations and delusions, although these could have been propaganda. Still, the symptoms align with a ruler increasingly removed from reality. His inner circle had thinned. He relied almost entirely on a small group of personal guards and eunuchs, many of whom feared him as much as they served him. The court became dysfunctional. Bureaucratic bottlenecks stalled governance. Diplomats avoided Constantinople unless summoned. Fear replaced order. Ministers began seeking quiet ways to distance themselves, leaving letters unsigned, avoiding direct speech, staying away from public appearances. Justinian's capacity to lead was weakening, but no one dared speak openly. His physical condition, never fully recovered since exile, likely worsened from stress and insomnia. Though there are no reports of chronic illness, historians believe his erratic actions in his final months were the result of mental and emotional exhaustion. The empire under his control no longer functioned as its ruler barely did. Despite these signs, Justinian remained in power. His enemies plotted, but few dared move. He still held the throne, still signed decrees, still ruled through fear. Despite worsening health, Justinian retained control over key decisions. There was no quiet decline, no drawn-out deathbed scene. Justinian II died by execution, captured and killed, during his final attempt to flee a collapsing regime. In 711, the city of Cherson revolted again, and this time the rebellion spread. Discontented factions in the empire aligned themselves with Philippicus Bardanes, a former imperial official exiled by Justinian. Philippicus returned to the capital with support from troops in the Opsikion theme, the same powerful military district that had overthrown Justinian once before. As the rebellion gained ground, Justinian made one last attempt to retain control. He sent orders to suppress Cherson's uprising and mobilized loyal forces, but the momentum had shifted. His rule had become so feared and so hated that even those still loyal to the empire did not rise in his defense. Seeing the capital slipping away, Justinian attempted to flee. He likely hoped to reach allies or to negotiate from exile as he had done years before, but this time there was no escape. He was captured and executed on November 4, 711. The execution was swift and without public ceremony. He was beheaded near the shores of the Bosporus. His severed head was sent to Philippicus, who had already entered Constantinople and declared himself emperor. Justinian's final decrees remain undocumented. There is no record of a last confession, speech, or political order. If he issued instructions for his son Tiberius, they were ignored. The boy, still a child, was tracked down and murdered shortly after his father. With that, Justinian's bloodline ended. His dynasty, the Heraclean line, collapsed with him. There were no honors, no imperial funeral, no mourning rites. The man who had twice ruled Byzantium died in silence, discarded by the very empire he had fought to control. In the years that followed, chroniclers would sometimes mention the strange rumors that surrounded his name. One of them was the accusation that he had engaged in unnatural acts, including a bestial relationship, likely political slander intended to discredit his memory. There is no record of such claims during his lifetime. They emerged later as exaggerated shorthand for cruelty and madness. What he left behind was not a legacy, but a caution. Justinian died on November 4, 711. Power was immediately contested. With Justinian II dead and his son executed, the Heraclean dynasty came to a definitive end. It had ruled the Byzantine Empire since 610, but within hours of Justinian's beheading, its legacy was erased brutally and deliberately. Philippicus Bardaeus took the throne in Constantinople. His first actions focused on reversing Justinian's religious policies. He deposed the sitting patriarch and promoted monothelitism, theological doctrine that had been declared heretical decades earlier. The move destabilized relations with Rome almost immediately. Politically, the empire was fractured. The army was divided, and provincial governors were unsure whom to support. Many had served under Justinian and feared being purged. Some regions openly resisted Philippicus, not in defense of the former emperor, but out of distrust for the new one. In Constantinople, the population showed no signs of grief. There were no riots in Justinian's name, no demands for justice. His brutality had left the capital exhausted and silent. His repressive rule had inspired no loyalty, only fear. Within a year, Philippicus himself faced revolt. In 713, he was deposed and blinded by his own troops. The pattern of instability, which had accelerated under Justinian, continued. The empire would cycle through emperors at a rapid pace: Anastasius II, Theodosius III, and eventually Leo III, all within a few years. The chaos exposed a structural weakness. Justinian had concentrated so much authority in his own person that no coherent system remained after him. There were no loyal institutions, no secure line of succession, no functional council. The empire had functioned around one man, and when he fell, it had nothing to fall back on. Religious divisions deepened, military readiness declined, tax systems broke down. His reign had left Byzantium more centralized, more repressive, and far more fragile. The historical record of Justinian began to evolve immediately. Justinian II remains one of the most controversial figures in Byzantine history. Historians have debated his legacy for centuries, some viewing him as a capable ruler undone by temperament, others as a tyrant whose downfall was inevitable. Early Byzantine chroniclers, writing under successors who had reason to vilify him, emphasized his cruelty and paranoia. They described his second reign as a time of fear and bloodshed, marked by arbitrary violence and religious intolerance. Later accounts added sensational elements, some unfounded, including claims of madness, hallucinations, and disturbing personal behavior. The infamous accusation involving a horse appears only in much later narratives, likely fabricated to further tarnish his image. Modern historians approached Justinian II with more caution. His first reign, while strict, included real achievements: successful diplomacy with the Umayyads, internal reforms aimed at tax equity, and efforts to stabilize frontier regions. These actions suggest strategic intelligence and administrative competence. However, the brutality of his second reign is not in doubt. His use of mutilation, political purges, and revenge executions alienated nearly every group in the empire. He saw governance through the lens of loyalty, and punishment trust was conditional, mercy rare. His rule became reactive rather than visionary. Some scholars argue that Justinian's downfall reflects the dangers of imperial centralization without institutional restraint. He ruled as an absolute monarch in a society that lacked the mechanisms to challenge or balance that power. Others point to the trauma of his mutilation and exile as transformative, shifting a once ambitious ruler into a man consumed by vengeance. His legacy was shaped not just by his actions, but by what followed. The empire entered a near decade of instability. The Heraclean dynasty was extinguished. The state had to rebuild its legitimacy from scratch. Today, Justinian II is seen less as an anomaly and more as a warning, a case study in how personal rule, unchecked by institutional limits, can end in chaos. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Justinian's rule. Justinian II's reign left behind no lasting monument, no celebrated reforms, and no heirs. What it did leave was a cautionary blueprint of unchecked power, institutional erosion, and the political cost of ruling through fear. His rule underscored a critical weakness in the Byzantine system. When power becomes centralized around a single figure, the collapse of that figure can unravel the state itself. The empire had no process for regulated succession. Councils, religious authorities, and even the Senate had been sidelined. In Justinian's model, control meant survival. But when control was lost, nothing remained to protect continuity. His mutilation and return to power shattered assumptions about imperial legitimacy. Before him, physical disfigurement was seen as a permanent disqualification. His restoration by foreign aid challenged the boundaries of who could rule and under what conditions. It introduced a dangerous precedent that even those cast out could reclaim the throne by force with foreign support. This precedent would echo in future power struggles. The empire survived, but not unchanged. In the aftermath, new emperors would take lessons from Justinian's rule. Some would attempt reforms, others would resort to similar repression. But the image of a gold-nosed emperor returning from exile to punish his enemies haunted the imperial imagination. The accusations that followed him, whether true or fabricated, became tools of political memory. Even the slanderous rumors, like the one alleging sexual depravity, were not simply character attacks. They were narratives used to reinforce that Justinian had violated not just laws, but the moral fabric of empire. His reputation became a negative example. It happens when power forgets restraint. In today's historical view, Justinian II stands as a figure defined not by accomplishments, but by consequences. His life is studied not for what he built, but for what he broke: lines of succession, civic trust, institutional balance. There is no grave bearing honor, no dynasty that carried his name forward, only the record of a man who rose twice, fell twice, and left his empire fractured in his wake. Power passed through him, but what remained was fear, silence, and warning.